Alright, so this is tuning part 3, and in this video we're going to look at bass drum tuning and setup. So, here we have two bass drums. Now, these bass drums are actually very similar to each other. They're both 18-inch bass drums. They both have the same number of lugs on them, a similar tom mount on top. This blue Tama is a little bit shallower in depth. It's, I believe it's 14 inches from here to here, whereas this Yamaha Stage Custom is 15 inches from here to here. The diameters, like I said, are the same. From the diameter of the drum here and here, they're both 18-inch drums. So this blue Tama drum is super dry and punchy for pop rock and every style except for jazz, and so let's give this a listen. The little bit of ring that we're hearing is actually not even coming from this drum, I don't think. I think it's ringing off that drum kit over there and ringing off of the drums that are over here, because, you know, when you hit something, the sympathetic vibrations make other things vibrate. So basically, there's no ring on this drum. It's just super dry. And that's because it has a sheet in the middle, okay, which is resting against the batter side head. So it's muffling the batter side head so that that head can't ring. And then we come around front, and there is a ported head on the front, a head that has a hole in it, so the air escapes much faster. And of course, we do this mostly so we could stick a mic in here and get a good sound for a microphone. And we can also, you know, deal with our muffling, take it in, take it out, move it around. It's worth mentioning this muffling, this sheet here, is also touching the front head. So both the front head and the batter side head are muffled quite a bit, and that's why this drum is so dry. Now, let's look at our jazz bass drum setup, and we'll give this a listen. Alright, so you can see this drum is tuned a lot higher. The pitch it's higher in pitch than this drum. This drum's lower. And of course, this drum has a lot of ring to it. We would call this a boomy bass drum because it has a lot of ring. It's not dry. It rings out as soon as you hit it. And then coming around to the front of the jazz bass drum, you can see this head has no hole. This is an unported head on the front of this bass drum. And you can't see, but there's nothing inside of this drum. There's no muffling, no sheets, no pillows, no towels, no nothing. The only muffling that's really going on in this drum is the fact that this particular drum head, this Remo Powerstroke 3, it has a little extra plastic around the outside that's actually, you know, physically attached to the drum head, and which makes this drum head just slightly drier. So basically, yeah, there's no muffling on this drum. It's what we would call wide open, so it can be boomy and ringy. So a quick A-B comparison back and forth so you can hear the difference. So really probably the biggest factor here in determining what you want out of your bass drum is how it's set up. So those are your two options. You have hole in the front with muffling on the inside, and you have no hole in the front with no muffling on the inside. So dry and punchy versus ringy, boomy. rock pop, everything else versus jazz. Okay, so that's the biggest thing. The actual head selection, like what you choose for heads, besides the hole in the front situation, but particularly batter side heads, what you choose there, it doesn't make as big a difference, actually. It really comes down to like the muffling and whether or not there's a hole in the front. That's the biggest thing. And then probably the second biggest thing is how it's tuned. The jazz drum, the pitch is higher, and the rock pop drum, the pitch is lower. So basically, when it comes to these setups, you're thinking about muffling versus no muffling, hole in the front head versus no hole in the front head, and then how it's tuned. So if it's a 18-inch jazz bass drum, you're going to crank it up a fair amount so that it's pretty high-pitched, actually. And then for everything else, rock pop or whatever, you're basically tuning it like kind of as low as you can. And it sort of depends on the heads you're using and the size of the drum you're using. But basically, you're tuning the heads kind of as low as they can go, because you don't want any ring, and if you tune really low, you're eliminating a lot of that ring, and you get more attack that way, because the head flexes when the beater goes into the head. It gets more surface area, so you get like more attack, more of that punch sound. And it can also kind of feel better if you're hitting hard and you just want punchy sound. You don't necessarily want a ton of rebound. You want it to be kind of dead feeling. Now, I should also mention, when it comes to the rock pop kind of thing, usually we're not using an 18-inch bass drum for that. Usually it's like a 22 or a 24 or a 20. 22 is the most common. I prefer a 20 for myself most of the time. But bigger drums like a 24 or even a 26 can be cool. But if you're putting muffling in the drum and you want it to be low in pitch and you want it to be big in sound, it needs to be loud. Generally, you're not really going to get that from an 18-inch drum. That's just worth mentioning. Okay? All right, so key points on muffling your bass drum. So, number one, I find, let me get the camera in the right spot here. I like muffling that goes about a third of the way up the drum. Maybe a quarter of the way up the drum. Depends on the size of the drum. But as you can see, this sheet here, the top of it, is about a third of the way up this drum head, more or less. And I find that's about right. Now, if you go further, if you go up halfway or whatever, a little further, it's just going to be way too dead and dry sounding, and it's not going to feel quite as good. And if you go with too little, like below a quarter or just a little bit in there, it's going to be too boomy, and there's actually going to be some ring. Now, obviously, you can fine-tune this to wherever you want it to be, but, I do see some people that just throw stuff in there without actually thinking about how it sounds, and, that's not the best way to do it. Realize that the amount of muffling that you put in the drum greatly affects the sound that you get out of the drum. So, another thing worth mentioning here is the fact that I always like my muffling to be touching both the batter side head and the front head on the other side there. It needs to touch both. Now, some drummers just like to touch it on one side or the other, but I find the best sound, the best feel is when it's touching both sides. And as far as material, you can use, this is an old bed sheet. I use towels, like a bath towel, maybe a couple towels. The right size pillow can work. An old blanket. Basically anything like that is going to work well in a bass drum. And another thing I should say is that like this is just, I kind of just threw this sheet in here. This drum, it doesn't go anywhere. It just lives in this room and just for drum lessons and practicing and whatnot. So it doesn't matter so much. But if you were like a gigging drummer and you're out playing gigs, or you're moving your drum all over the place, every time you were to move this drum, that sheet would get displaced. And every time you set up your kit, you got to reposition your sheet. Sometimes you might forget and it's not going to sound so good. And then sometimes, like, you might not have time to deal with that, you know? So if you are going to be moving around your bass drum that has muffling in it, the best thing to do is to either buy or make some sort of muffling that like stays in place. So what I usually do is make my own out of like towels and Velcro, and I just put a strip of Velcro on the shell of the drum and Velcro on the muffling, the towel, or whatever, and that keeps it in the same place all the time. Obviously, you can buy things like this. There's plenty of those kind of products on the market that'll be good muffling and won't move around every time you move your drum. That's the basics of bass drum tuning and setup. It's really those two sort of primary methods. And you know, there's some other outlier ways of setting up bass drums, which maybe I'll do in another video. But you know, for most of us, we're usually thinking about these two methods. So depending on what you like and the type of music you're playing or whatever, you're probably going to choose either one of these approaches to your bass drum. Cool. All right, I hope that helps, and I'll see you in the next video.